Hey, what's going on, guys? Phil here. So, I just got done with a coaching session on Even Paladin, so I wanted to showcase the two lists that we ended up with, kind of give a shorter video with my thoughts on the archetype in general, how it kind of lines up in the metagame, and the different kind of lists and tech cards you can go through to change up your list a little bit. So, this was the list that we ended up coming to for standard Even Paladin. There's a couple different like experimental archetypes of Even Paladin going around. So there's a dragon variant going around, which we also have a list to show. But this is definitely more typical. Um, you get to run right now. There's not a lot of weapons around in the metagame, so only one ooze is fine. Typically, I would run two oozes in Even Paladin. Um, as for two drops, Kangor is pretty standard. Wild Pyro is really standard to combo with Equality, as well as combo with any kinds of spells like that. Going into the mid game, Corpse Taker Blessing of Kings is very standard. It's one of the like most strong two-card combos that you can have in the deck, and it allows you to really like push your mid game from good to incredibly powerful, especially in control matchups where a buffed up Wind Fury Corpse Taker can just take over the game. With the rest of that, we have Double True Silver just as a control tool. Sometimes you can go phase with your weapons, that's cool, but it's mostly there for control. We have one Argent Commander just because sometimes you need a little bit of extra burst damage to get through control matchups, as well as it's a very good reactive card against aggro. We have one Avenging Wrath. I'm not positive on whether or not one or two is correct, but one feels pretty good. It allows you to combo with Equality to clear a board and deal some face damage. It also can just be used standalone on like one or two minions, or on a big wide board of minions to try and clear, and then in certain circumstances face damage. So it's really just versatile. Two kind of gets clogged, but one feels pretty good. You gotta have Gen so that you're Even Paladin. Mojo Master really helps you shore up your late game versus control decks. A lot of the time, control decks can try to grind you out. You'll run out of gas, or their threats will just become bigger and bigger. But Mojo Master helps you kind of reset them. So if you have like a big board, and then they start getting into the later turns with more mana, you can Mojo Master, limit their resources, and still have your still maintain your board. So that's really good. Mojo Master has definitely found a home in Even Paladin. It's a card that was hyped up a lot before the expansion as really useful, and it's mostly shown its effectiveness through Even decks. So it makes sense that it shows up in Even Paladin. Spiked Ridge is just incredibly powerful versus aggressive decks, and it's kind of like a miniature Blessing of Kings for your Corpse Takers or for your Wind Fury Harpies to try and get some extra damage in there with Wind Fury. So that's cool. It's mostly there for the aggro matchup though, and it's really powerful in the aggro matchup. Sunkeeper Tarim is the best Paladin card ever printed, so it will go into every list that it can fit into. Obviously can't fit into Odd Paladin, but Odd Paladin gets Stonehill and almost always wants Sunkeeper. If you're looking in a deck that specifically doesn't run it for Sunkeeper Tarim, you can tell that the card is just incredibly powerful. Valnir, it's a weapon that helps you get more value going into the late game, so it helps you shore up those control matchups that we talked about with Mojo Master that kind of grind you out. Getting the infinite weapon swings as well as the extra stats can be really useful, especially if you land the extra stats on something big like a Lich King, or a charged minion, or a Corpse Taker, or a Wind Fury Harpy, something that's just a big threat. So that's pretty cool. Wind Fury Harpy is there to give your minions Wind Fury, or your Corpse Takers Wind Fury to help your mid game. Because if you look at Wind Fury, especially in Even, you basically have this is the only option because it's the only Even Wind Fury card. Aside from that, all the Wind Fury cards suck anyway. So yeah, that's there specifically for Corpse Takers. Bone Marrow is a one of is a tech choice. It basically helps you in both aggro and control, because in aggressive decks, or against aggressive decks, it allows you to have a taunt minion, or be able to push for a little bit more pressure, make some good trades. And against control, it means that in the late game, your 1/1s that you make can actually become more threatening. It's very useful for burst, and yeah, it's just overall like lots of the Even Paladin cards are very versatile. That's what makes the deck pretty strong. It's not spectacular versus aggro, it's not spectacular versus control, but the fact that it has game versus everything because of its versatility is what makes it a very strong deck. Lich King, best 8-drop ever printed aside from Ragnaros, so it goes in there. And then Tyrion, just another late game threat. The Ashbringer, if you're able to get it off, is a very good tool against control, because 15 damage burst that they're not expecting is really good, and there's not a lot of weapon removal going around in the meta right now. The main card I wanted to talk about in this little section about Even Paladin was the Hydrologist. Hydrologist is a 2-drop, which kind of fell out of favor, or at least in my lists it fell way out of favor for a long time in Even Paladin, but it's kind of seen a resurgence as just a good, 2-mana 2/2 is fine to help you get through the early game, and then it allows you to discover Secret, which gives you some extra resources and can change how you play the rest of your game. So in lists where your 2-drops are only there mainly to help you survive the early game, they're not really cards that are there for a specific purpose, like that are just really good, like a Kaliseth or something like that. It's important to find 2-drops that have additional benefits. So in the past, the 2-drop of choice for most Even decks, or at least Even Paladin, was either Amani Berserker or Plated Beetle, both of which are 2-mana 2/3s that have slightly useful effects. So Amani Berserker is just a 2-mana 2/3 that sometimes can deal a little bit more damage. Plated Beetle gives you some armor. But in the same vein, Hydrologist gives you extra resources. It generates value. And especially considering the fact that Odd Paladin, even after the nerfs, has seen a resurgence with Frostwolf Warlords, there's a lot of tokeny boards around. So getting the secret that costs 1 mana and is a spell is a semi-synergy with Wild Pyro against aggressive decks, because you get an extra proc of the dealing 1 damage to all minions. So essentially, cards like Hydrologist, off the top of my head, thinking of other 2-drops that are mostly run just as 2-drops, but also have useful effects that either change your game plan or change your opponent's game plan. Something like Gnome Feratu in Warlock, and anything that just generates value or disrupts your opponent is good to look for in your 2-drops. So if I could replace all of my 2-drops aside from Ooze with Hydrologist, I would. If I could run infinite copies of Hydrologist, I probably would in this list, just because getting the extra value and like each secret makes your turns change a little bit depending on what you get, and that versatility is really good in a deck like this. But yeah, so this is the standard list. It's very strong. I believe in the coaching session we went like 3-0 or 4-0, potentially 3-1 with this list, and it feels really, really good. The Bone Mare is pretty strong. It's one of the cards that you can consider cutting. Basically, the cards you can consider changing out. You can change out the Amani Berserker for another 2-drop of choice. You could potentially get rid of Silence, but I really like Silence on this list. You could potentially cut Avenging Wrath for another late game threat or mid game like advantage pusher minion. And you can get rid of Bone Mare if you really want for more late game, or you can get rid of Tyrion. But this list feels very, very strong. So that's great. Even Paladin, pretty good right now. It has game versus both aggro and control decks, so it's definitely a good middle of the road point. Looking into more experimental versions of Even Paladin, we have this Dragon Even Paladin. There's multiple versions of Dragon Even Paladin running around, but this seems to be one of the most common and also one of the stronger ones, and we changed it up a bit during the coaching session. You get to run Cathedral Gargoyle and Fire Tree Witch Doctor as your 2-drops of choice in this deck, instead of Hydrologists and like an Amani Berserker or a Crystal Smith Kangor. You don't have to run the Corpse Taker package. Instead, you get to run some of these dragon cards like Evan Dragonsmith, Scale Worm, and Silver Sword, but you really miss the Corpse Taker package in Even Paladin, it turns out. Even Paladin, its mid-game is really, really strong if you have Corpse Taker, and without that it kind of falls flat, because you're just playing like, 4 mana 3/4, 4 mana 5/4 with Rush, like you're just playing some stats. And that's just not good enough in a deck that's not planning to just always go face. Corpse Taker is a giant threat that needs to either be answered with, which is good because it means that your late game they have less answers for, or it gets to just dominate the mid game. So with this version, you don't really have a card that does that same job. Instead, you're trying to shore up your mid game with getting an Ebon Dragonsmith hit onto Silver Sword and getting value over multiple turns with a Silver Sword. And in theory, it's really cool. When it goes off, it feels pretty good, but your draws have to line up really well for this deck to work. You need a dragon in your hand for Cathedral Gargoyle and Fire Tree Witch Doctor to become at all relevant. You need a weapon in your hand for Ebon Dragonsmith to be at all useful. You need a dragon for your mid game. So a lot of the time, your draws can just get kind of like they can just kind of screw both your early and your mid game, which is one of the things that you can't allow happen in a game of Hearthstone. If you pass your first like 3 turns just making 1/1s, you're done for. There's nothing you can really do. And this deck, that happens a lot more often than it should, it feels like. The way it wins is through that Silver Sword interaction with Ebon Dragonsmith, getting that out early in your mid game and pushing that advantage earlier than it should be able to come out, which sounds great in theory, and in theory it is pretty cool. When it goes off, it's pretty fun, but it's just overall weaker than your standard Even Paladin. Bone Drake feels surprisingly good, though. Kind of in the vein of what we were talking about with Hydrologist and value generating 2-drops. If you're ever looking for another like mid-game to late-game threat for Even Paladin, anything that just generates your resources is cool. So Bone Drake, Arcane Dynamo, kind of cards like that that just give you extra resources are really the cards you're kind of looking for. You could also consider running a Nerubian Unraveler. You don't have a ton of spells in your list, but that's definitely for the more standard version. That in this you have stuff like Fire Tree, which gives you 2 spells. You have the spells you already run. So, anyways, Dragon Even Paladin overall feels a lot weaker than your typical Even Paladin, but the archetype as a whole is pretty interesting. If there's ever a way to tutor Paladin weapons, then the Ebon Dragonsmith, Silver Sword, and then Weapon Tutor could definitely become a very strong package. But overall, right now, this deck is quite a bit weaker than its counterpart. So, in conclusion, here is the Even Paladin list that we decided on. The last card down here is Tyrian Forging, and it's pretty okay in the meta. It can outvalue, it has game versus everything. It's kind of like how Hunter, like, you can make a very aggressive Hunter deck that can deal with early game, and then with DK Rexar, you can basically have game versus control just with that one card. With the use of Valinir, Lich King, and Tyrian, you kind of get that same late game, like, hey, I played, like, 2 or 3 cards on my list, and now I at least have a chance versus control, if it gets to the late game. And your early and mid game is very, very strong. So, if you want to take advantage of that, here's that list, and I hope that you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Down in the description box below is the link to the Discord, so if you are interested in joining the community or getting any coaching, anything like that, feel free to join that as well, and I will see you guys next time.